Hello, and welcome back to the 𝗧𝗵𝗲 𝗧𝗵𝗲 podcast. I'm your host, Posh, and I'm happy that we're on episode 7. Wow, this is very interesting, and what I want to talk about today was triggered by mainly two things. You had the 7 that I just said. I'm just impressed that we made it to episode 7. And today, or maybe less than 30 minutes ago, I'm online, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm very active on the space, and I'm going through, different kinds of, I'm scrolling, and then someone posted something that goes in the direction of so many people are afraid of making a bad decision that they would not even start at all. And I remember just going there, and I most likely, commented on that. And, and then at the back of my mind, I'm thinking, oh, today's recording day. So I got to record episode 7, right? And I was like, hold on, episode 7? How did we even get here? And the background of the story is this podcast could have been older than a year now. Literally came to my mind on the 18th of February 2025. That was last year. That is what was on my vision board. That is when I was supposed to start. And, I sat down, I made a plan, and I said, okay, I got to start this podcast because I know, the message as people waiting for it. And I'm naturally a speaker. Speaking is something I enjoy. Speaking is something I believe that I'm gifted with, and it comes to me easily, right? So October 2024 is when I actually sat down to make those plans, and the plan was 18th of February 2025. The podcast is gonna air. Now ask me why it took exactly a year for me to do that. Because if you go on the podcast, you would see that, episode 1 aired exactly on the 17th of February this year. It took a full year for me to take that idea out of my head and actually do it. And here's a confession I will make about myself and who I am, right? I procrastinate in a very comforting manner. I picture myself as someone who has a plan, someone who's building something, someone who is putting their hands on something. And for years, that's where I was. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to build wealth, and I just never did. It was in my head, And that's exactly what happened with the podcast, And so I remember going through a season where, this is now beginning of this year. I did like an audit of my life. It was a season. It was not a single month. I think it started around October when I had a specific visitor at my place, and they got me thinking about a lot, when it comes to people that I associate with or keep close to me. That is a whole episode on its own. So I started a life audit between October 2025, getting into the beginning of a year. And I wrote down every other dream I had, every plan I had, everything I said I was going to do, whatever, some things I had given time frames, some things I had not. And I looked at that list and I said, girl, so what did you do on this list? And I didn't make it to a quarter of that list. And I remember thinking to myself, Lord, help me. And I think we do this naturally as a people, right? Life is difficult. I'm trying this, I'm trying that. I'm just an, immigrant, and things are hard. But have you even tried to put an effort, right? Whether you plan to work for a specific organization. I know a number of us have that kind of behavior where they're just places that we have always wanted to be. in our whole lives, or your goal was trying to build healthy relationships with other people, or you wanted to switch your career and start something different, beyond just thinking about those things in your head. And when I say I did an audit, it's not like I was going back into properly written plans, because I've done writing before. And then the more I leave, the more it doesn't seem to be reality, the more I just ignore those things and I move on with my life, right? So I had to recompile, and they were coming out of my head. And I'm like, hang on a minute. So it has taken me all these years to have plans that I've never even materialized. I've never taken time to sit down and say, listen, you said you want to do this, let's do that. You say you want to work for the United Nations. What did you apply for? Sometimes it's not just getting yourself into that space by working there and, becoming the big boss and whatsoever. Even the voluntary stuff that they offer. What have you put yourself into? What have you even made an effort? And I'm not saying where you are accepted into it. Just doing your part before external people come into the picture, right? And that's when I realized that, I think to a very huge extent, I've been my own barrier. Just having this fear, maybe it will not work. I'm just a girl from Zimbabwe. There's so many opportunities that are not accessible to a person like me. And you are having these conversations in your own head, on your own, before people get to tell you that. And this is not to discredit that life as we know it is not fair. It's a fact. But what conversations are you having with yourself, right? This is just really one thing that I've been working on. And for me, I have a very loud brain. I don't know if you can already tell, I have a very loud mind, right? But in having that loud mind, I have to train myself. I'm sorry, I have a cold at the moment. Anyway, I'm training myself to come to peace and harmony with my thoughts, but I am forcing myself to do those things, to take them out of just being thoughts and actually executing those things. So it ended up being the best quarter of my life. First quarter of 2026, amazing, because here's what I did. I sat down and I said, the podcast has to start. And you believe me or not, life has an interesting manner of showing us, what we are meant to or what we are not meant to do. I remember recording the very first recording, and I think every other podcaster have been there. I deleted it. I did again. I deleted it. I did again. Until I said, Portia, you know what? Technology usually doesn't fail. The way it's recording, that's exactly how you speak, and that's what it is. So you're going to record this one and you're sending it out as it is. I'm sure some of my episodes, I'm saying words wrong, pronouncing them differently. Hey, I'm just an African girl. English was never the first language, right? I'm doing my best. But I had to convince myself that there's nothing wrong with my voice. There's nothing wrong with my ideas. There's nothing wrong with my story to start with. We are doing this, right? So that's how I sat down after setting up the podcast, of course, and I'm doing research and I'm like, okay, what am I supposed to do? Where do I send what? How do I connect, the podcast with, where I'm creating with every other platform? It was a process that, I could have easily just said, I'm not doing this. And I know that a lot of people give up on that because, it's, anything that you're not used to and you don't know about, it takes a little while for you to get into the feel of things, right? But that's what I did. I had to do the podcast. I launched it. I launched 2 different newsletters. So there's a newsletter for this podcast, and there's a newsletter for my work, for my career side of things. And I think most people don't know that, but I'm into AI engineering, and I do talk a lot about leadership in this AI era and trying to find a balance between traditional leadership and leading in this era while you keep the human at the center of things, So that's what I talk about on that platform. And beyond that, I started my process to look into migrating again because, coming to Germany was never a long time thing for me. I was coming here to study. Somebody just told me, oh, in Germany, you study for free. And I took a plane. Until I got here, I was like, it's not exactly as what we were told. But, it's just, I'm saying this to say, sometimes just putting your foot forward, even if you don't know what's there, it's already a foundation for something, right? So I launched all these things and I started processes for all these things. And I told myself that this year, my goal is every idea that comes into my head, I'm going to do it. I don't care whether I'm scared. I don't care whether, it might be frustrating. I don't care. I just have to do it, And it's very interesting how it's becoming a behavior. I remember the other day I thought, I need a routine. Let me check out the gym, right? And I walk into the gym and said, do you have personal trainers? And they said, yeah, they do. And then I registered myself, and that's how I started. Because knowing myself over the years, I know I could just say I would do it. I would do it. I would do it, until it's, God knows, forever, right? And last night I had a conversation with a good friend of mine. She was really telling me about amazing things on how to improve your skills, whilst in Germany. In my case, I would want to go to a different continent, but I want to take with me some of the ways of doing things in the German industry, right? And I was like, girl, I still have time, I still have a few months. Let me enroll in this thing. And so that's exactly what I did. I went to bed yesterday. I had put up my paperwork. Today, I just called the woman, gave me information, and I'm enrolled, right? Why am I saying this? Not as a superhero, but this is someone who has done 3 decades of just pushing things. And yet I was convincing myself that I'm in check, that I'm doing everything good. I'm as empowering as it gets when I'm around my girls. I'm motivating and empowering everybody. But then when I really looked at it, I'm like, I haven't achieved a lot, despite how much I talk, about achieving things, about starting this, starting that, how many companies are in my head and they are nowhere to be found wherever you find the records of companies that have been started, right? But it was interesting to me what fear does to us. It was interesting to me what the conversations we have with ourselves, they have way more effect than what other people say to us. I've shared this before. I grew up with very brutal, stepmoms, and I think the normal day-to-day for me was just being reminded how useless I am, how I can never achieve anything, how ugly I am. The list goes on and on and on, how I amount to nothing. But when I really then look at it, I trained my brain to ignore and to shut those voices. I mean, I even went out of my way to separate myself even physically, not just mentally. So I left, that environment. I left that home, that city, ultimately that country, that continent, right? But when I separated myself, I got to a point, if you ask me today, I really don't care what those individuals think about me. I've come to terms with it. I've accepted what it was. And then I'm like, so what is still holding me? Now, what remains is the joint partnership, if I would call it, of what had been said, what I then started believing, and then I'm left with the things that I then accepted as true, So they don't say it anymore, at least without me hearing them, but it's still echoing in my brain. And you see that when you're preparing for an interview or you are having a conversation with, a co-founder and you're working on what you want to build. And every time you see how you want to make a decision, And then there's this little voice that comes in and tells him, not really. You can't do this, you can't do that. Of course, you'll come back and convince yourself otherwise, but ultimately, those little voices are still not silenced. And that's where the fear is coming from. It's now coming from within more than it used to come from the outside, right? And by me talking about this, I do not want by all means to ignore the fact that even though I'm living in my post, survival era, right? I'm living in my aftermath of everything that happened. But I want you, if you are listening to this, to know that even if you are there right now, you are part of the conversation, because one thing that will happen is you will come out of that space at some point, right? If we have, you too can. But before you even get to that space, I think one thing that I could have had during that time was even to start training my brain how to live in the post era of everything that happened. Because it's not like it all just shut out of your brain and you are, supposedly now living a life of no problems, so to say. It's still there. But one of my biggest things that I'm really working on right now in my personal life is to train myself for what's to come. Because the beautiful days are gonna come, the season where no one ultimately has power over controlling your life. At least my abuse and everything I survived happened mainly in my childhood. But even though it happened in my childhood, I think I was so focused on living. And in my head, I thought once I leave, everything is solved. But little things kept on following me. And that's something I'll have to talk about on a whole different episode. When I left my country, there was all, molestation, physical, emotional abuse. And when I left, I came all the way to Europe, and somehow I still saw the traits of how people would treat me. It kind of like took me back there all the time. So this is something that we'll have to talk about on a different other time. But I'm saying this to say it comes back to show you those things that are still like monsters in your life, things that you are scared of, things that make you not want to try anything, because your subconscious is convinced that you are not the person who does that. My growing up, and I grew up in an African homestead where still they are, you just get married to a useless poor guy somewhere, and then the time comes where you're trying to have relationships, and almost all the time it almost feels like it's actually coming to be true. It's proving to be true, what has been said before, right? And if it's not, you get a relatively great person, but they don't care much about you like that. They don't show that respect. They don't honor you as a human being like that, right? So where does this fear of, because I think most of the times we are judging like, oh yeah, people procrastinate, oh that's so horrible for you. I really doubt that there are a lot of people who come up with ideas and they just run with it right on the go. It's really something that you out of weakness in my case, I look back and I'm like, I'm not being progressive right now. I need to do something. So now what I'm doing is, I'm not perfect at it. I actually am forcing myself to do it because I know I would not, right? But we ultimately just rush into judging people who procrastinate, and we don't ask the question of, where is this coming from? Where does the fear come from, right? Why is this like this? My career is something that has been crushed for a very long time. I remember my stepmom said, well, there's nothing really you will come up with in your lifetime. And the idea of me building companies now, every time I look at it, I have to I have conversations with myself. And I think sometimes when people are around me, they'll be like, I hope she's not going crazy. There are times I literally loudly go, shut up, you know, shut up. Because I know if I don't keep on doing that, it will take me back in the places that I don't want to be, right? And I've been working so hard to come out of that space, and now I'm here, right? So this is just something that I thought of talking about this week. And I'm still crossing my fingers. My hope is really that this podcast is not about me at all. I want us to come to a place of then having conversations, but at the same time it's also important to build this foundation of just hearing a little bit, glimpses and pieces of who I am, what I've been through, what I go through, and what I'm looking forward to, so that it helps to get to know why, at least in my world, I thought of starting this podcast, right? Because I do consider myself a survivor by in every way. And I want this to get to where we get to have conversations, where you send in, topics that you prefer, things you want to hear about. I bring in people who have survived different kinds of things in life, and we get to have those conversations. So this is a short one for you, and I will be off to it's actually my birthday week this week. So I will be off for that. And yeah, I hope you can digest this one, and we can have conversations about it. Feel free to send your messages on the podcast on TikTok. We will respond to those messages, or you can send emails, or you can just comment really directly on whichever platform that you are listening to the podcast on, and we will have those conversations. Thank you so much for listening and for being here. And I'm wishing you a lovely week. I'm your host, Posh, and I see you next week.